Good morning, class. Sorry that we're going through this pandemic. Got to do the best that we can. Thanks to most of you for submitting your homework. I'll be getting in touch with the others. Generally speaking, very good answers, but I thought I would make the screencast to help you with 9-mark questions. They're quite difficult because, in a way, they're neither here nor there. They're neither complete essays nor short answers. So I think doing a screencast on this is a very good idea, and it will give us a few tips, etc., for how to answer these particular questions then. Okay, first of all, I want to draw your attention to Michael Layswing's resources. I'm going to send this PowerPoint to you on Show My Homework, so do use the link, and all of these links work here as well. They take you to Michael Layswing's excellent resources, and I've just highlighted the ones that are relevant to our AS level exam. So at present, we're going to proceed with the idea that you may very well be doing some kind of complete mock exam. So I would suggest working daily and preparing as you would for the real AS level exam. In addition to these resources, if you look on the right side, there's a tab called flashcards. And they have 3 or 4 different sections. All of them are very excellent. They've got the generic ones that will help you with terms like a priori, etc., just to give you, and things like synthetic a priori, etc., and very good for revision. There's also a section for epistemology and a section for moral philosophy. Okay. Now, what does Michael Layswing say about 9-mark questions? He says they ask you to explain a more complex argument than 2, 3, or 5, or a set of arguments, a theory or a comparison between theories, or some other material. The marks all pertain to A01, which is showing understanding. Okay, you're not required to evaluate in the 9-mark questions. That's only for the 15-mark questions that bring in A02. So this is very important because, as he says, any time spent on evaluation is wasted. So don't evaluate in these. This is showing understanding, explanation, being absolutely crystal clear, structuring your answer well, and illustrate it well. So do not discuss whether you agree with it, whether you think it's a sound or valid argument, etc. As with 5-mark questions, the examiners are looking for clarity, precision, and an explanation, key idea there, that sets out the central claims in a way that demonstrates the logical links between them. The answer needs to work as a single whole rather than a number of disconnected bits. So as with any good piece of writing, whether it's in history essay or politics essay, etc., using discourse markers, using linking phrases that establish flow, coherence, and connection so that the answer works as a whole. And we'll look at that today as I do the screencast, okay? Now, here's a good example of what a 9-mark should look like. I think some of you are writing too much at the moment. This is the model answer from Michael Layswing. He takes a typical question, typical 9-mark question, explain what Aristotle meant by an involuntary action. And this is what Layswing says. Aristotle divides actions into 3 types: voluntary, non-voluntary, and involuntary. Voluntary action is action that brings about in the knowledge of what you are doing. Actions can be involuntary as a result of either force or ignorance. Either you aren't choosing to bring about the action or you do not know what you are doing. When we act involuntarily, we do so with pain and regret. Force. We can be forced to do things involuntarily by physical forces, e.g. losing one's balance on a moving train, and by negative psychological pressure, e.g. threat of pain. Where no one could withstand such pressure, we don't blame somebody for what they do. This shows that what they do is involuntary. So here Layswing is addressing the issue of agency. Ignorance. The kind of ignorance that makes an involuntary relates to the an act involuntary relates to the particular circumstances of the action. For example, what are you actually doing? What its consequences will be, what tools you're using to act with, or how, in what manner you are acting. Some actions done as a result of ignorance are involuntary, some are simply not voluntary. The difference lies in whether the action is one that causes us pain or regret. If you accidentally step on someone's foot and you regret this, then stepping on their foot is involuntary. But if you don't care, then it is simply non-voluntary. So we see in that 9-mark question there that he's divided it into 3 sections. However, there is no rule. I've seen answers that get 9 out of 9 that are written as a solid paragraph. I've seen some that are written as 2 and some that are written as 3. There is no rule. You have to make the decision on what you regard the correct number of paragraphs to be. But that is about the ideal length, and this particular answer would score 9 out of 9. So when you go back and look at the homework, some of you will see that you wrote a little too much. And don't forget, if you're writing a great deal for the 9 markers, then you're going to give yourself less time for the more important 15 markers. To remind you of the mark scheme, to get into the top here, it needs to be complete, accurate, and precise with all necessary information. Logical steps, no irrelevant points, and that's what's really interesting. So if you're writing more than Michael Lacewing did there, often you may lose marks for what we call redundancy, when the information is in there and it didn't really need to be in there. It wasn't strictly pertinent to the question. So be very careful about putting too much in, okay? And as always, philosophy is obsessed by the correct use of terms, okay, and to relevant philosophers as well. So many of you are fitting in here at the moment. You're clear, you're reasoned, you're mainly accurate. To move into this, usually it's a case, I think, of more flow, more coherence, more logical steps, better structured and accurate use of philosophical terms. So I hope that gives you a good general idea then of what to do in the 9 markers, okay? So, questions worth 9 marks require demonstration of knowledge and understanding. As we've said before, no redundant material. This is what the exam boards say, very important. So do not put in examples and points that are not relevant. For the longer examples, save those for the 15 markers, okay? And of course, the answers must be logical and integrated, okay? And a very good example of a 9 marker is briefly explain Bentham's utilitarianism and how this theory can be applied to simulated killing. So in this case, I think this is a 2-step question, and you would be looking, I think, for 2 discrete paragraphs there that address each aspect of that question individually. No need for an introduction or a conclusion in the 9-mark question. Definitely an introduction and a conclusion in the 15-mark question. So these were the questions that I set you. Briefly explain Bentham's utilitarianism and how this can be applied to simulating killing. 2. Explain Kantian deontological ethics and how it can lead to competing duties. 3. Briefly explain Aristotle's virtue ethics and how it might be used to justify telling lies. 4. Explain the difference between moral naturalism and non-naturalism. Okay, so let's have a quick look at these then. First of all, Bentham briefly explained Bentham's utilitarianism and how this could be applied to simulating killing. Now, the examples that we're going to look at now are actual examples that have gone to the exam board, and I will finish by looking at the mark that they got and a little explanation for them. I think these will be very useful to you because, as I say, they show that the answers are a bit shorter and more focused than many of you realize. Bentham's utilitarianism argues that an act is good only if it maximizes overall happiness. Happiness is achieved by increasing pleasure and reducing pain, according to Bentham, and this should be the pleasure of society as a whole. Key point. This principle of wanting to maximize pleasure for most people is known as the principle of utility, the greatest good for the greatest number. Bentham believed that pleasure could be measured by using the utility calculus, which consists of looking at the intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, difficult word, fecundity, purity, and extent of the pleasure produced by an action. Let us take the case of simulated killing, where a person plays computer games where they have to kill people to score. In general, it can be said that this video game increases the happiness of the person playing it and does not harm anyone. There have been suggestions that as playing simulated killing has risen, actual crime rates have reduced. If we apply the utility calculus, we can see lots of people do definitely gain happiness from simulated killing, certainty. The happiness of playing these video games can last quite a long time, duration, and can be of great intensity. But this can lead to addiction. So the purity of the pleasure gained is not so highly rated. Playing simulated killing games could be seen to produce other pleasures and reduce pains, fecundity, such as a reduction in crime rates, development of motor skills, and the creation of jobs for those who develop these games. These pleasures gained as almost immediate propinquity. Overall, Bentham and the hedonistic utilitarians in general would agree with simulated killing. Now, this is a very good focused answer. You'll see that it is placed into the two paragraphs and it addresses both aspects of the question, and it does so quite succinctly and in a focused manner. It includes a very good example there and all of the necessary terminology. Okay, so let's see what the exam boards say about this. 7 out of 9. The answer is almost perfect. To achieve full marks, other examples of utility, i.e. points from the utility calculus, should also have been included. However, it demonstrates great application of knowledge and good use of technical language. So overall, you would still get an A for this, 7 out of 9, but they feel as though we need to address this idea of more points from the utility calculus. Now let's move on and look at the next question, okay, that I set you, which is explain Kantian deontological ethics and how it can lead to competing duties. Now we know that Kant is very complicated. However, I think in philosophy we mustn't forget that we love being brief. Think about Occam's razor. Think about cutting away any fat and anything unnecessary. You're going to get marks, not for very long answers, but for very focused and tight answers. So let's practice these 9-mark questions and get them right. Let's look at this answer that the exam board gives us. Kantian ethics is a deontological theory that focuses on the act itself rather than the consequences. It is based on a good act being an example of a categorical imperative. You'll notice all of the terminology being used. A categorical imperative is an imperative that is duty-based and can be worked out rationally. Key point. We take a maxim, a subjective principle, and see if this can be universalized as a law without there being a contradiction. If it can, then the next step is to see that if it does not treat others as a means to an end. Could actually mention there that that's the second formulation of the categorical imperative. If it does not, then this is a good example of a categorical imperative, which is our duty to follow. So that addresses the first part of the question very well indeed, I think, explaining deontological ethics. It's to the point, it has the terminology, it is extremely focused, and there is no redundancy. One problem with Kantian deontological ethics is what happens when we have conflicting duties. I like it in philosophy when people use rhetorical questions. The maxims "do not lie" and "do not steal" are both good examples of the categorical imperatives that we should follow because they can be universalized without a contradiction, and they do not treat others as a means to an end. But what do we do if we have to choose between the two? If a friend tells you to keep the secret that you stole and the police ask you whether they stole, would it be better, according to Kant, to tell the police the truth or to lie to keep your friend's secret? Kantian deontological ethics cannot help us with this dilemma. So again, what I want to point out in that particular answer there is this particular writer, they're almost kind of tempted to evaluate Kant's theory there, but they just stop short of doing so. They explain why there might be a conflict in duties without going into a full critique, which is what you're going to need in a 15-mark one. So when you're asked something like that, the trick is to make sure that you don't fall into AO2 evaluation, that you keep it tightly focused on AO1, which is to do with understanding. What does the exam board say? The exam board tells us that the answer is detailed and correct. It answers both parts of the question and shows good knowledge and understanding, which is what they're looking for, and it scores it at 9 out of 9. Now, you might find that a very high mark. I certainly do. And it should be comforting to you to show that you don't have to be absolutely amazing to get full marks. You just need to be tight. You need to use the terminology. You need to avoid all redundancy, and you need to be highly logical and highly structured. Now, if we have a quick little look at Sarah Atif's answer here, where she's looking at the difference between contradictions in conception and contradictions in will, I'm just going to read out her answer. I'm not going to give it a mark in the screencast. I'm going to let you guys think, and you can then send me a mark out of 9 that you think it deserves. Sarah says universalizing a maxim leads to it being valid, or to it failing as a universal law and being a contradiction. There are 2 types of possible contradiction: contradiction in conception and a contradiction in will. Contradiction in conception is where the maxim, when universalized, is no longer viable as a means to an end, meaning we cannot imagine a world in which this was a law. And very helpfully now she goes for an example. For an example, a man needs money. He intends to borrow the money and promises to pay it back, even though he has no intention of doing so. The maxim for this action would be, when in need, make promises with no intention of keeping them to help. Very good example. I think it shows this idea of how we have to universalize in order to see the categorical imperative. This maxim leads to a contradiction in conception, because it relies on the institution of promises. But if everyone followed this maxim, there would be no institution of promises. The man is willing that we all live in a world with no promises, but simultaneously willing that he gains more money via giving a false promise. Okay, so we see the contradiction in conception there. This is impossible because we have a perfect duty to keep promises. Breaking a perfect duty is always wrong, and your action would always be wrong. Whereas a contradiction in will, where the will of a person contradicts what the universalization of the maxim implies, meaning we cannot imagine a world with the maxim, but we cannot rationally will such a world. This is a contradiction in will and leads to an imperfect duty. Okay, interesting one here from Sarah. I would be inclined to feel that the explanation of the contradiction in conception is perhaps superior to the explanation of the contradiction of will. So I'm going to leave you guys to decide what mark you would give Sarah in that particular one, but good effort. Now, moving on to a different question, briefly explain Aristotle's virtue ethics and how it might be used to justify telling lies. Aristotle's virtue ethics is an agent-based ethical theory, meaning that it is about the person carrying out the act rather than the act itself. Virtues need to be practiced over a period of time for that person to become virtuous. These virtues are the mean between a deficiency and an excess. Truthfulness is a virtue that is between boastfulness as an excess and understatement as a deficiency. This means that truthfulness is related to self-deception rather than to deceiving others. Aristotle does not mention any other virtues that relate to telling lies, but he does believe falsehood is in itself mean and culpable. Now, we all know this, that Aristotle carte blanche condemns lies, and from his point of view it becomes difficult to justify them. But we mustn't forget that Aristotle, he may be the originator of virtue ethics, but he's not the sole kind of person that we refer to. Lying, like adultery and murder, has no mean and so cannot be virtuous. However, there may be occasions when telling lies could be virtuous. For example, you could tell a lie to save someone's life. In a situation where you're being tortured to get you from the secret formula for a new chemical weapon you have developed, a virtuous thing would be to continue to lie. This would be virtuous because it may show courage. A coward would tell the truth, and that would result in millions of people's death. A rash person who is overconfident would tell the enemy the secret formula, thinking that they wouldn't be able to work it out anyway. So according to virtue theory, telling lies can be virtuous, taking other virtues into account, and is therefore justified. I think that's a really excellent answer. Let's see what the exam board said. I'm not sick, honestly. Level 3. The answer demonstrates full understanding of virtue ethics and how it can be applied to justify telling lies. There is a good example. I think that was a very, very strong example to illustrate when it might be acceptable. There's also good use of philosophical terms, and it shows good knowledge of Aristotle's text. I would go beyond good and say that was absolutely excellent. Moving on then, let's have a look at another 9-mark question. This particular one is explain the difference between moral naturalism and moral non-naturalism for 9 marks. Okay. Moral naturalism and moral non-naturalism are two cognitivist theories. Very important that we realize this. Metaphysics and metaethics is extremely complicated. Cognitivist theories believe moral statements are factual. Truth act, in other words. There are moral facts and they refer to real things in the world. However, moral naturalism believes that moral statements are concerned with natural properties, i.e., that is, psychological properties, which can be tested and are objective facts in the world. So that's moral naturalism. Utilitarianism is an example of moral naturalism. It claims that happiness, in the form of pleasure, can be measured empirically, making it factual. So we don't need to go into too much more detail there. You could possibly put in a line about Bentham in particular because of his felicity calculus, where he's actually giving you a kind of formula so that you can arrive at the fact. Moral non-naturalism, on the other hand, believes that moral statements are not natural properties. They cannot be measured empirically. Moral properties may be related to certain natural properties, but this does not make them natural. We're going to go on to more now. Instead, moral non-naturalism may claim that moral statements are a product of rational intuition. Now, intuition was a key term here. Intuitionism, supported by G.E. Moore, you'll remember him, is an example of moral non-naturalism. According to intuitionism, moral statements are self-evident and therefore in no need of empirical proof. So you see both sections there are answered very well. It's a question that asks for two different things. So we have two different paragraphs, and I think that both of them are very clear and very, very well focused. Let's see what the examination board says. This answer is complete, clear, and correct. The examples given are relevant and show understanding. The answer gets straight to the point. See, remember what I said about loving brevity in philosophy? And explains every philosophical term used. All necessary philosophical terms are included and used throughout. 9 out of 9. I'd like to add to that the writer also did not go on to evaluate some of the problems with Moore. Now, we know that there are a lot of problems with intuitionism, but again, I want to remind you, don't go into AO2 skills in 9 markers, okay? Now, I hope that gave you a really good insight into how to answer these 9-mark questions. I think that I'm going to give you all a little bit of individual feedback as well in terms of those. And I think next I'm going to be setting the 15 markers. But for now, I hope that's given you a far clearer understanding of how to answer the 9-mark questions.